In this video series, this will be the network design that we will use, and it will involve our FortiGate firewall that's located here. It will be a FortiGate 60D model, and our focus will be mainly with configuring this device. There will be some configuration that we will do on the core switch and some on our router that's connected to the internet. So this diagram will show how everything is connected, including all of the IP addresses and interfaces that will be used. So this is a typical design that we have completed for some of our customers that are using a FortiGate firewall. So we would do various changes to this particular design when we configure different features and protocols like static routing to even BGP routing. But let me quickly talk about our design that we'll be using for this video series. And of course, like our other video packages, a larger version of this picture will be available in this training package. In summary, on our firewall, we will be using two interfaces. One will be our external facing interface, or WAN facing interface, which is labeled as our WAN 1 interface that will be connecting into our lab internet cloud. And the other interface shown here will be connecting into our internal network. And this will be our LAN facing interface that will connect into our LAN core and access topology, which is shown right here. So we will have many different networks that are connected on our internal network. One of them will be our server network, which is where all of our servers will reside at. We will have our corporate user network that will consist of our users, computers, printers, and other user endpoints. We will have a dedicated network for our guest users and bring your own device users. There'll be a wired network and a wireless network. So these will be different networks that will exist on our internal network here. And we will have an administrative network, which is what we will be on when we configure our FortiGate firewall. That network is reflected right here, and this reflects our computer right now. Also in this diagram, we have a remote site that is connected off of our lab internet. This will be a Cisco router that we will configure a VPN tunnel between our firewall and this Cisco router for communication. So let me discuss some of the aspects of this design in more detail. Within our design, there is a topology and deployment aspect for the LAN and the firewall that should always be considered for any design. The topology for a LAN or a data center, which is basically the same, just different functionality, will either be a two-tier topology or a one-tier topology. That is the most common. But it can also be a three-tier topology, which is more common for larger networks with many large buildings like a campus. Now, some of these components within this type of topology are a core, an aggregation, and an access layer. In our environment, we will be using a two-tier LAN topology that will consist of a core and an access layer. Our core switch will be a Cisco Catalyst 3750 switch, which will be a layer 3 switch supporting routing capabilities. And our access switch will be a Cisco Catalyst layer 2 switch that will connect all of our particular endpoints for guest users and our user computers. So this topology here will make up our LAN and data center solution right here. Now, connected to this topology will be our internet edge solution that consists of a firewall component that is being plugged into the internet cloud. The deployment for the firewall in the solution is typically in line between the LAN and data center and the internet cloud. The firewall can also be in line between other networks, like between a LAN and a wireless network to provide security with the wireless environment. But in this particular environment, we will have our firewall in line between the internet and our LAN, which is reflected in our main design diagram. As I mentioned before, we will have several networks that will be used, and this page provides a summary of those networks. We will have a WAN-facing network that is connected to the external network, which will be our lab internet. And that external network right here will be configured on the WAN-facing interface of the firewall. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that it says public network, and this is the actual subnet that will be configured based on our design. Now, this is not a public network. This is a private address that is part of our lab internet cloud. So I just want you to keep in mind that for a practical deployment, you will be using a public network that is provided to you from your provider. So I just want to make sure I mention that. And of course, we will have our LAN facing networks, which is connected to our internal network. One will be a transit network that will exist between our firewall and the LAN for routing connectivity with our internal network. We will have a user network and a server network, and you will see those networks and VLAN details listed here as well. Other LAN-facing networks will include a dedicated network for our guest users and our bring your own device or BYOD users, which is a common thing for networks today to include. And there'll be a wired and a wireless network reserved for these guest and BYOD users. We will also have a VPN network that will be dedicated for VPN user access. When we configure our VPN address pools, they'll be handed out to our users. But this page provides a summary of the type of networks that will be used in this particular series. Next, we have the routing design, and there are two types of routing that we must configure in order for all of our networks to communicate out to the lab internet. There is internal routing, which is routing that exists between the internal LAN or data center and our firewall. This is important for our firewall to know about the user and the server networks, for example. And there is external routing, which is routing that exists between the ISP and our FortiGate firewall to allow access to the internet. In this video series, for the internal routing, we will be setting up some static routes, but we will mainly be configuring OSPF, which is a dynamic routing protocol that will be configured on our core switch in our environment. For external routing, we will be configuring a default static route, but we will also be configuring BGP with our ISP. So those are some of the topics that we will cover in this particular series. We will also be configuring many different VPN solutions as well. For client VPN, this is a VPN tunnel that is established between the firewall and a user's computer or a laptop. We will have an internet computer that is connected to our internet cloud, and we will connect to our FortiGate that will be enabled for IPsec and SSL VPN. So we'll be configuring both of these solutions for remote access. So once again, doing that, this will allow our remote users to access some of the internal networks that we have, and we can specify what those networks are that our users can access. We will also be setting up a site VPN, which is basically a VPN tunnel that is established between two VPN devices, like a router or a firewall. Now, this VPN will be between our FortiGate and our Cisco router that you see listed in our network diagram. This tunnel will be configured as an IPsec VPN tunnel that will allow the networks from both ends to communicate with each other without using a VPN program that is needed for some of the client VPN solutions. And of course, we'll be configuring several different security mechanisms, which is the main function of any firewall. And below here are some of the main services that we will be configuring and will be shown in this video series. So we will be doing some basic level filtering. Some of it is probably more advanced than others, but some of this will involve filtering traffic based on the network, the protocol, the port number, or even the IP address perhaps. We'll be filtering based on the user's identity, based on the Active Directory group that they are a member of. So user filtering can be done passively or actively. And we will be covering both of these options, and we'll show how they can be used practically. We will be filtering based on the device or the endpoint that can be used by a particular user. Like maybe they're using an Apple or Android mobile device, and we can have particular policies for what they can access or what their authentication is required. And of course, we'll be setting up two-factor authentication using a mobile token. That's one of my favorite particular features of this firewall. I love this firewall. We will also be setting up some advanced security controls, such as filtering based on the application and micro applications that a user is accessing, like Facebook or Dropbox, for example. We will also be setting up IPS control. We'll be doing antivirus blocking, website filtering, endpoint control, file blocking, to even traffic shaping. And that concludes some of the main highlights of the FortiGate firewall. and the design that we will be setting up in this video series. Therefore, continue on to the practical videos that we have to learn how to set up the FortiGate step by step.